Hello everyone, I've given the title The Unfrench French to this class because I want to talk a little bit about regional nationalism or kind of separatist movements that existed across France in the 20th century. We're probably familiar with the fact that in many countries today there are kind of separatist movements, various nationalist groups who want to break away from the larger nation state of which they are part. Some famous examples: Catalonia obviously tried to stage an independence referendum in 2017 and tried to break away from Spain. Scotland in 2014 had an independence referendum vote, and possibly might have another one again in the relatively near future. And by these standards, it looks like France has actually been relatively successful. In our lecture, Peasants into Frenchmen, we talked about how there was a variety of cultural and regional identities and linguistic identities in France that the French state had tried to kind of bleach out and dilute over the course of the 19th century. And in this class, I want us to see that while these old frontiers were broken down to an extent, that these lines did not disappear completely, and there still are some people in France today who don't really regard themselves particularly as French. Perhaps the most famous nationalist movement in France in the 20th century belonged to the Bretons, or Brittany, in the northwest France, and that actually evolved in a couple of different ways over the course of the 20th century. I want to begin actually by giving you my own little anecdote. So here, this picture here is actually from Ireland. The islands in the background are the Blasket Islands, which are famous in Ireland for being one of the last communities in Ireland where the Gaelic or Irish language was spoken exclusively. And they also produced an impressive number of actual writers in the Irish language, given how small the community was. And in the foreground, there's a visitor centre. So the island itself were abandoned in the 1950s. The visitor centre in the foreground is there to commemorate both the literary achievements of the people from the island and also to kind of discuss the hardships of island life in the 19th and 20th century. And I was there in 2010 just visiting it for my own interest, and I got talking to a guy who was there with his wife. This guy was probably in about his 50s. To me, he had a very French accent, and so I asked him, like, "Oh, are you from France? Are you French?" And he said, I remember just being surprised by a response, very adamant, "No, I'm Breton, I'm not French, two totally different things." So we want to explore, I guess, this Breton identity to some extent. So Brittany, I guess, began to acquire a distinct identity from the rest of France dating back to the 6th century, when a wave of immigrants from Britain settled in the American peninsula in the northwest of France, and they brought with them their own distinctive language, which today we call Welsh. But in the 6th century, many parts of Britain, people spoke the Welsh language. It wasn't confined to the area we know as Wales today. And these people seem to be fleeing from an incursion of Anglo-Saxons, a wave of Anglo-Saxon settlers into the island of Britain, and those people eventually go on to establish England. So this seems to have been an example of people trying to flee kind of oppression or land pressure back home. On the right of the screen, we have medieval Brittany here. It was divided into 3 different kingdoms. And if you look at the most western name here, the Cornouailles, looks a lot like Cornwall, and in fact it was. The names of these various Breton kingdoms looked and sounded a lot like places like Cornwall and Devon back in the southeast of England. Eventually these kingdoms were united into a single duchy or dukedom of Brittany, and the Duchy of Brittany managed for a long time to retain its independence both from the English and French crowns. Over the course of the 100 Years' War, both the English and French tried to kind of conquer Brittany and annex it, but it largely managed to retain its independence. It wasn't until the 1480s that the final conquest of Brittany really is achieved by the French state, and even then, it's a little later that the actual union between the two entities begins. So the woman pictured here on the left is Anne of Brittany. She was the last independent ruler of Brittany. And in 1491, she married a guy pictured here on the top, who is King Charles VIII. Charles VIII died after a couple of years, and so then Anne married Louis XII, and Louis wanted to marry her specifically to try and keep the territories of Brittany within the Kingdom of France. And that's kind of the formal union, or it's the beginning of the formal union between Brittany and France, and Brittany's incorporation into the French kingdom. Although it's not until 1452 that the King of France automatically becomes the Duke of Brittany, and the two titles become synonymous after that. Nevertheless, so Brittany becomes part of France, we'll say around 1500, but it retains its very distinctive culture and language for centuries afterwards. This here is the Orff order in French on the right and Breton in the left. I just wanted to show you this real quick just to give you a sense that the Breton language is quite distinct from French. It's not a dialect of French or a closely related language at all. They are completely mutually unintelligible, and they are the Breton language is a Celtic language. French is a Romance language, so there is actually a reasonably big gulf linguistically between the two. We've already seen that start with the onset of the French Revolution, the French state became more concerned about trying to preserve or create linguistic homogeneity. And it really starts to try and undermine the various regional languages of France in the 19th century. And while that was motivated by, sorry, I hear my daughter is upset downstairs about something. While that was motivated by French nationalism, in some ways this nationalism also kickstarted a response amongst Bretons themselves and the advent of Breton nationalism. And one of the most famous early proponents of Breton nationalism was the guy pictured here, Charles de Gaulle. Obviously the name rings a bell with us. This Charles de Gaulle, in fact, was the uncle of the more famous Charles de Gaulle from the 20th century. Charles de Gaulle here was actually not from Brittany at all. He was from the northeast of France. He was a very sickly child. He moved to Paris as a teenager and became interested in studying languages, became aware of the Breton language, began studying the Breton language, learned it, became fluent in the language, and generally became a proponent of Breton identity, Breton linguistic survival, and also became what we call a pan-Celtist. In fact, he was one of the first pan-Celtists. What do I mean by pan-Celticism? Basically, de Gaulle was promoting that the various Celtic nations, and by Celtic nations, they're here on the map: Ireland, Scotland, Wales, Isle of Man, Cornwall, and Brittany. The Celtic nation essentially refers to any place where a Celtic language was once widely spoken, encouraging these various groups to try and form some kind of political or cultural union between them. And so in 1867 he organised a festival that mostly only hosted Bretons and Welsh visitors. It was a way of celebrating their kind of common linguistic bond. Another famous Breton nationalist was the guy pictured here, Francois Jaffrenoux, who was born in Britain. He was a fluent speaker of Breton. And in 1897 he established the Union Regionaliste Breton, the Breton Regionalist Union. This was not a movement trying to advocate for political independence, but rather it was advocating for more to be done to preserve the distinctive cultural identity of Brittany. Its language, obviously, but also the kind of traditional costumes that were associated with Brittany. We sometimes think of areas having distinctive costumes. Perhaps the most famous are the kilts we associate with the Highlands. There was an old kind of peasant costume in Brittany that really wasn't worn anymore, but Jaffrenoux and his friends were trying to encourage people to wear these costumes again and kind of bring about a revival of them as well. Jaffrenoux in 1899 travelled to the Royal National Eisteddfod of Wales, the Welsh National Eisteddfod. What is an Eisteddfod? Essentially, it is a cultural festival that celebrates also has competitions in singing, nowadays dancing, although not back then, and particularly in literary prose and poetry competitions. And Jaffrenoux and his fellow Bretons who visited the Eisteddfod in Cardiff in 1899 were kind of amazed at the kind of great passion the Welsh had for their own culture and wanted to bring back or infuse some of that amongst the people of Wales themselves. Amongst the people of Brittany to feel likewise. In fact, Jaffrenoux was impressed with the Welsh national anthem, Land of My Fathers, Hen Vad Fi Niadiol, and he essentially translated it into Breton, and brought it back to Brittany and said this is now the Breton national anthem. And to this day, the Breton national anthem essentially is a Breton translation of the Welsh national anthem. Another institution he brought back from Wales was the Gorsedd. A Gorsedd was essentially a gathering of Druids. I mean, that's what this should look like here. These are people dressed up as Druids. It was supposed to be an ancient institution in Wales. It was really invented by a guy called Iolo Morganwg in Wales in the 18th century, although people didn't realise he'd invented it until the 20th century. But essentially, people dressing up as bards, as Druids, and going through these kind of Druidic rituals. Jaffrenoux was impressed by these movements and wanted to copy it, so he brought the same idea back to Wales or to Brittany. And in 1903, the Breton Gorsedd was established, and Jaffrenoux made himself the first Grand Druid of the Breton Gorsedd. So Jaffreno and his allies, the union, the union of Breton regionalism, were really focused on Breton's cultural identity. But we do see the emergence of political nationalism in Brittany as well. And one event that kind of kickstarted it was the creation of this sculpture here. So a French sculptor called Jean Boulcher was commissioned to create a sculpture to commemorate the union between France and Brittany in 1491. And to do so, what essentially did is he created a sculpture of the marriage between Anne of Brittany to Charles VIII. But a lot of Bretons did not like this sculpture. It was unveiled in the town hall in Rennes, which is the capital of Brittany, in 1908. And a lot of Breton nationalists were kind of outraged because Anne is kneeling here. They interpreted that as a sign that Breton essentially was subjugated by the French state, and they didn't like the symbolism behind it at all. And in response, in 1909, these two gentlemen here, Louis Napoleon Leroux and Camille Le Mercier d'Hermes, two Breton nationalists, created the Breton National Party to try and encourage Bretons to push for political independence from France. They also established a Breton journal, Suffrage d'Échelle, so Free Brittany, encouraging people to kind of reject their French identity and embrace a sense of Breton political separatism. This kind of nascent nationalist movement was cut short, however, by the outbreak of the First World War, and the divisions that it created within the Breton nationalist movement itself. Some Bretons, and Francois Jaffreno was an example of this, felt that it's our duty to defend France. We need to participate in the Union Sacrée. We shouldn't be getting caught up in nationalist movements. So Jaffreno and others went to join the French army. But Louis Napoleon Leroux, on the other hand, fled the country, fled to Switzerland so he wouldn't have to fight for the French army, because he felt that would be a betrayal of his Breton identity. And eventually he made his way to Ireland. So in the short term, that kind of stalled the Breton nationalist movement. An important event in the Breton nationalist movement actually took place in 1916 in Ireland, the Easter Rising, where a bunch of Irish rebels attempted to overthrow British rule by staging a rebellion in Dublin. The rebellion was defeated, but it inspired a new generation of Irish nationalists who began another campaign against British rule in Ireland in 1919 that eventually led to Irish independence in 1921. And this inspired a lot of people in Brittany to think they could do the same thing. I mentioned Louis Napoleon Leroux. So the guy pictured here, this is Patrick Pearse, who was the kind of the leader of the 1916 rebellion. The first person to actually write a biography of Patrick Pearse was Louis Napoleon Leroux, who had managed to make his way to Ireland and very much spoke about how Pearse and his comrades were the heroes of Breton nationalists who wanted to do the same thing. This is a poem here, published in a Breton journal after the First World War. So you see the winds of freedom are blowing across the moor, despite the Franks and their efforts, and the Franks obviously here is referring to the French state. It blows increasingly strong. The wind of freedom is blowing across the moor. It awakened the valiant Sinn Féin and the Fenians. That's referring essentially to the Irish rebels. The winds of freedom are blowing across the moor. Tomorrow after the Fenians awake the great Chouans. So the Chouans were Breton royalists who fought against the French revolutionary government during the French Revolution. So obviously you could understand the symbolism of that being important for Breton nationalists. They were able to co-opt these guys who really were fighting for the king, but imagine them as people fighting to defend Breton independence. A new French Breton journal was established in 1919 after the First World War. So it means the name means Brittany forever, and you can see the 1916 the Irish gunman. That's kind of who they're looking up to. Two important young Bretons who kind of also were inspired by Ireland are Olivier Mordrel and Francois de Beauvis. De Beauvis was only 15 when the 1916 rebellion broke out, but he began going around the town of Rennes, painting Vive l'Irlande on the walls. Whereas Mordrel talked about how he kind of dreamed of doing the same thing as the Irish rebels had done by capturing a post office in Rennes and staging a kind of dramatic fight to the death with the French state. And in 1927, Mordrel helped establish the Parti Autonomiste Breton, the Breton Autonomous Party that began to push for Breton political independence from France.